Good morning, everybody, and let me start off by thanking the Central Bank of Chile and in particular its Statistics Division for organizing this very interesting conference and to extend an invitation also to the WTO. As you know, the WTO is very much associated with globalization, and some of you may remember that in the 90s, the WTO meetings, the ministerial meetings, attracted the anger of many anti-globalization protesters that made it difficult even to organize those meetings. Nowadays, they focus on the G7, and so that is maybe makes it more peaceful at WTO meetings. The WTO, of course, in its mandate is very much behind the globalization that we are seeing. It's set of rules and regulations and obligations, as well as the binding commitments on tariffs and non-tariff measures on goods and services, have set the stage for companies to take longer-term investment decisions, plan their sourcing and their sales strategies. This all requires predictability and stability, and that is what the WTO framework provides. My presentation is in two parts. In the first block, I will give a brief introduction to the concept of global value chains. I will talk about the importance of the trade policy environments, that is my specialty actually, and will provide some simple measures of globalization. In the second part, I will address some of the tools that are out there that are being used to measure global value chains. I would like to also say at the outset that this is not actually the main core activity of WTO. The WTO does not collect actually any of the statistics that are associated with this global value chain measurement. But of course, the WTO encourages national statistical office and international organizations to do this work and collaborates with them to set international standards so that the data that is collected is also of use for the WTO in its work. In particular, I would like to mention the work with the OECD on the trade and value added database, and I would also like to say that for the bulk of the work is done in Paris and the OECD, and the WTO contributes to doing analysis and disseminating this work. Let me first have a broader perspective and looking back in history. One can associate two main big phases of globalization. The first phase is basically associated with the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine, the electricity, which led to a large onset of industrialization, mainly in the north, through technological innovations. And what we see is that actually in this period, which started in the middle of the 19th century, that at the same time, while this industrialization took place in the north, we saw that the final goods that were produced in mass and large scale also were exported globally to the south, which in turn handicapped with their industrial development. And it is interesting to see that if you look back, and I refer to work done by Richard Baldwin, a quite well-known trade economist, is that the share of the G7 countries in around 1820 was about 20% of world income. By the late 80s, this share has gone up to 2/3 of world income. So it's quite an impressive growth of its share in that period. Now, the second revolution started in the 80s and then took on speed in the 90s, and now it was the revolution in information technology. And as this took place, it made it possible that much more production could be outsourced to developing countries. At the same time, industrialization had started in many of the emerging economies, firstly sort of behind fairly high tariff walls to protect the domestic industry, and later on it became obvious that it was important to also allow imports to develop the industry better. And it happens then that as of this period in the late 80s, the share of the G7 countries dropped back to below 50% actually by today, and is going to drop further. So this is quite interesting, that the globalization and now the possibility to divide the stages in production into even finer sort of steps and tasks through the information technology, through the advances in logistics and communications, that made it possible to not only initially have a domestic global value chains, but increasingly global value chains. So they have a much broader dispersion, not only of the production, but also geographically. A brief definition of global value chains is sort of the international organization of production, trade and investment, where different stages of production of goods and services are located across countries, regions and firms. Essentially, it is considered to be trade in intermediates, goods and services. Also, services are increasingly important, and services are easily sort of transportable across countries. The global value chains, we talk of sort of backward and forward linkages. Backward linkages are refer to the imports of foreign products to produce goods and services for exports, and the forward linkages is the export of intermediate products to produce exports in another country. Here in a more schematic presentation, we see, for example, an example of sort of plastic production. The oil comes in from one country, goes to the second country, then is into plastic production. Then you have plastic box manufacturing, and in the end, sort of the labeling till it reaches the final consumption. So this is a chain or ladder kind of way of global value chain. You have here the forward linkage is a linkage seen from the exporting country of this trade flow, and from this country's perspective, this would be a backward linkage. So the same flow is like exports and imports. The export of this country is the import of this country. In global value chain talks, this is a forward linkage, and this is a backward linkage from this perspective. In a slightly different presentation, I just wanted to make the distinction. See the blue arrows into this economy are supposed to be final products, so they got final products for the domestic consumption. And here this economy again does the same to the next country, whereas here the global value chain products, they go in, are further treated, receiving domestic input as well, and then going on further to the next economy. So this is just a schematic way to show you the terminology of backward linkage and forward linkage, and distinguishing it from the intermediate goods that go into the domestic consumption and production. When we talk of global value chains, of course, we have to talk of trade and value added. Because traditionally, trade flows are growth flows. So if you trade one good, export from one country to the other, and do some processing, add a bit of value added and export it again, you count again the full value of the product. Now this leads to a lot of sort of double counting. If you add up all the trade flows, there's a lot of double, triple counting that goes on. So you exaggerate a lot what actually is traded in terms of value added. So this is one advantage. So in addition, you are able to assess much better the actual contribution of the economy to a trade flow when it goes out. It is interesting that you have currently the debate in the US about the NAFTA, and that there is this big, huge trade deficit. And of course, people say, well, you have to look at the actual trade and value added, and not at the gross flows. And it's interesting that I read recently that now the US Commerce Secretary sort of came up with a study where they adopted at least the methodology of looking at trade and value added, but still came to the same conclusions. The conclusions was basically that the US value added in Mexican exports to the US has gone down slightly over time. And this was seen as a reason maybe to question the current trading arrangements in NAFTA. But of course, you can go further and sort of find other arguments. But just to tell you that at least the approach, the methodology has been adopted, and which is already a good thing. This is another schematic presentation of the value added. So you have the gross exports from country here, Brazil to the UK of 50. Now the UK adds some value added, sells it on to, in this case, Spain. So the gross flows would be 50 and 150. And it looks as if all comes from the UK, but in fact, 50 comes from Brazil and 100 comes from the UK. Coming to the next point, the importance of the trading environment. What are the factors that affect GVC integration? There's the structural factors and policy factors. Of course, it is very important to be close. The geographical distance still plays a role. Being close to the main hubs, sort of close to Europe, close to the US or Japan, does matter. Of course, country size also matters, because if you have a bigger country, has more bigger pool of labor, a bigger pool of skills, that helps. And of course, how well developed this country already is. But coming to the policy factors, and that's where the WTO comes into the picture, the trade and investment policy is very important. Open trading policy does help to participate in global value chains. And that's why it is very important. You see that countries that have a more diverse export and import base usually have also many more trading arrangements with their partner countries. The strengths of financial institutions, of course, the skill sets that's available, and last but not least, restrictions on services trade. The more open the trade and services is, the easier it is to integrate into global value chains. The importance of the predictability and stability I mentioned already. At the same time, you see that global value chains increase the demand for liberalization and lower the demand for trade protections. Because if you need to participate in global value chains, you have an interest in lowering your protection on imported inputs, which you intend to export again further. Because if you had high duties on your inputs, it would automatically increase the cost of your exports. So there is a interest in going for further trade liberalization and not try to protect your domestic industry if you want to participate in global value chains. And anything related to the cost of trading should also be facilitated. That's why we have this trade facilitation agreement. It's the last sort of big achievement at the Nairobi conference for the WTO, which should help to basically reduce the paperwork and the red tape at customs to facilitate the trade flows. Non-tariff measures. Non-tariff measures do matter a lot. And those that follow the debate on Brexit will have probably also noticed that there's a big worry about how the UK and vice versa, likewise the EU later on, will manage the vast set of regulations that have been set in place by the EU, including the UK, once the separation takes effect. Because if you have diverging regulations, that means you will have need more control at borders about the product. So this will handicap very much the existing web and very strong integration of the UK in the European markets as concerns global value chains. So multilateral agreements play a crucial role in lowering trade costs. While the WTO framework provides the basic rules, the basic framework, we see also that preferential agreements can add further to improve the trading environment. And we see in particular that some regional trade agreements that go very deep in opening and making the regulatory framework compatible do aid in the integration into global value chains. I just want to present some simple measures on globalization, simply looking at the diversification of HS of 6-digit level exports to the world for a number of countries. We have looked at sort of the exports to the 18 major markets from countries all around the world. It is interesting to see the differences in HS diversification of different countries and over time. It reflects on the one hand resources, endowments, population, skills, and so on. It shows also the competitive strengths, and it is an indicator of the integration in world markets. So you see here for a number of countries the product diversification over time. You see here on the vertical axis the number of HS 6-digit codes, and there are 5,000 standardized codes. And over time, the axis from 1996 to 2014. And you see that the big players, EU, US, and China, which caught up here, are nearly at the top. That means they export nearly all the products from the HS spectrum. Whereas you see some of the bigger developing countries here, Brazil is in the middle, and very interesting, you see a country like Vietnam has caught up enormously, and that is very impressive. Likewise, you see India here and Turkey that have caught up over time in terms of increasing the diversification of their exports over time. You see Chile here, there's not much change over time. Likewise, a few other Latin American countries down here. Another statistics I looked at to how many partners on average per HS code a country exported over this period. And again, you see the EU here having by far the most diverse sort of partner distribution. But you see how China caught up over time. It's very impressive. The US is a bit less diversified, and Japan even more. And you see here the changes for India and Vietnam, which have considerable growth rates here over time in terms of their partner diversification. Since global value chains are associated with sort of trade in intermediate goods, I just show for a few countries the trade shares of intermediate goods over time. You see the goods for consumption, intermediate goods, and capital goods. You see the increase for China. It mostly happened sort of as concerns intermediate goods. And you see, like in the previous charts I didn't mention, always a kink in 2008, 2009 as a result of the financial crisis. It is very impressive to see the high diversification of Switzerland, a very small country with 8 million people. But there you see it is the closeness to markets as well as their very skilled and high population. Okay, I will go then a bit faster. You see Vietnam, you see Chile here. Now, coming briefly to the tools for measuring GVCs. Basically three approaches. Sort of very often you see in the press a case study approach where you talk of sort of a particular product, where it comes from, which stages it goes through till it ends up in a particular market. You see the microdata approach based on state statistics and business registers, as well as the more macro approach using supply, use, and input-output tables. This is for Nutella. I won't want to go into detail because I'm running out of time. The iPhone, if you look at the growth flows, you think everything comes from China. If you look at the value added, you see that China actually contributes only a small part, and that the bigger items come from other countries, actually. Trade statistics and business statistics. Trade statistics are described at a very micro level, very much detail. I showed 5,000, often it's up to 10,000 products. The flows in and out of the countries. Usually they don't worry too much about statistical units. They just measure the trade flows. On the other hand, you have the business statistics, structural business statistics, which describes the structure and evolution of businesses. And they record a lot of detail on the businesses, but they're not necessarily very strong on focusing on the trade flows, the exports and imports. Now, while these are based on different concepts, and this brings me back to the last presentation of yesterday, the lonely data, these are sort of basically two very important sets of data, but they're in silos. They're lonely, they're not connected, and it would be very important if you can bring them together through using the same IDs to get much more information by marrying these two data sets. The good thing of these two data sets is they rely on real information, real statistical data. It's not based on estimates. It is already collected, and therefore no need for additional work to collect the data. We can extend it to cover all the businesses. So there's a real incentive to create this link. If the link doesn't exist, it's not always easy to create the links ex post. And therefore, I think there is an interest to build it into the statistical recording already from the beginning, or if you haven't done so, start doing it. Now, the other approach is based on supply, use, and input-output tables. Supply, use, and input-output tables, supply and use tables are the core of national accounts calculations. Input-output tables, on the other hand, are a derived product, and they require much more estimation, as the commodity inputs of the supply-use tables have to turn into industry, so they have your symmetric table, which can then be used to do the kind of simulation work that is very interesting, but at the same time, it is estimations. I worked about 35 years ago on input-output tables, and then already I remember the problem of creating input-output tables, the time lags, the stability of coefficients. All these are issues that you have to take into account when you work with input-output tables. It's still good to do some simulations. It gives you some interesting results, especially the interlinkages of industries, the direct-indirect linkages. But you have to be aware that it may be based on coefficients that are no longer up to date. This is two-country input-output tables. Important thing here is we need to have more international standardization. We should also be wary about the response burden. It's no use to have sort of extensive questionnaires if they're not answered. I mean, it doesn't help. I would like to also mention that the same applies to international organizations in asking countries the same question from different organizations, so we should be wary of that as well. It would be ideal, and actually this is very much in line with the talks of yesterday. I remember Paul Schreer's talk of microdata linking. This was mentioned by Sanjeev, and of course the last presentation on the lonely data sets. If the data is interconnected through unique identifiers and even can include administrative records, we would have a much vaster pool of information that can be used for better tracking what's going on in the economy. And last but not least, I think it is important to maybe go beyond the national perspective and try, in particular for the assessment of multinational enterprises, to try to sort of link internationally even IDs so that you can know what a certain multinational company does in one country. You can link it to their activities in other countries. Well, I think I just want to conclude with this quote from the last line in the report by Timothy Sturgeon, which has actually the same title as my presentation, is that the statistical system needs to modernize and internationalize to provide appropriate and timely information that can support agile and evidence-based policy making. We have seen recently that in presidential elections in some major countries that unfortunately sort of the arguments are often not based on sort of evidence, statistical evidence, but on emotions, and sort of that we need to be aware that only if we have the right timely statistical data at hand can we try to counter these kind of arguments. So on this note, I would like to close and thank you for your attention.